Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
He had that look in his eyes, the kind that said he thought he was being brave, progressive, visionary even, like he was about to deliver a TED Talk instead of telling a man 28 years his senior that his career was no longer convenient. I'd seen that look before in my life, more than once, usually worn by someone who read 2 leadership books and thought empathy meant speaking slowly while wearing sneakers with a blazer. Braden Chase was 27, full of kale shakes and podcast wisdom, and he had just enough power to be dangerous without knowing how fragile the floor beneath him actually was. The Zoom call started with small talk, because that's the new professional courtesy. Waste the first 3 minutes asking about the weather and the weekend before you stab someone in the back with a smile. He adjusted his AirPods, glanced off-screen to make sure his lighting was right, then hit me with it. "Tom," he said, hands steepled like a startup monk, "we've been reviewing team performance across the board. And while we appreciate everything you've done here historically, there's concern from leadership that you're not showing growth. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life. Careful, cautious, sometimes too damn patient for my own good. But I'm not stupid, and I'm not deaf to subtext. Not showing growth in today's corporate speak means you make me uncomfortable because you remember how things used to be, and I'm afraid you'll question my shiny, untested ideas." Still, I didn't flinch. I let him talk, because sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let someone think they're teaching you something. He went on for a while, fumbling through a script I'm sure HR had workshopped to sound positive. Evolving roles, agile realignment, opportunities to pivot, the usual bullshit. When he said the phrase, legacy mindset, I nearly laughed, because that's what they call experience now, a liability. Like knowing how the machine works from the inside out is something to apologize for. I nodded, once, closed my notebook with one hand, and gave him a smile that probably confused him. "Thanks for the feedback," I said. He looked relieved, maybe even proud of himself, like he'd handled it well, like we'd just completed some sacred rite of performance management instead of ripping out the last working bolt in a system he barely understood. He said, "You'll get an email from HR with the transition steps," and then he logged off before I could say another word. But I didn't need another word. I'd already said everything I needed to in the infrastructure they stopped paying attention to years ago. You see, Braden thought I was just some aging code monkey who never adapted, who couldn't keep up with innovation, which is what they call it when they push quarterly rebrands and plug-and-play systems nobody properly audits. But I'd built the original architecture for our customer routing environment. I'd written the scripts that handled traffic during server spikes, created manual overrides in case the new automation ever failed, and patched a load balancer with a coat hanger and a prayer during a Christmas Eve outage while the rest of the office was on vacation. And not once had I bragged about it. Before I logged out for the last time, I opened a file, one I hadn't touched in 2 years, tucked inside a directory so dry and technical nobody under 30 had ever bothered to look. It was a simple script. Nothing malicious. Nothing illegal. Just a silent routing sequence. Something that used to catch failover traffic during our weekly maintenance windows when the system load exceeded 90%. I commented out 3 lines. Not deleted. Not erased. Just silenced. The script would still run. It just wouldn't catch the overflow. It wouldn't reroute the traffic automatically when the new load balancing layer, the one Braden's team insisted was cloud-native and future-proof, inevitably hiccup during a high-traffic deployment. No alerts would go off. No red flags would wave. But the moment the system hit peak load and failed to route cleanly, the client portals would stall. Services would drag. Response times would tank, and nobody would know why. It wouldn't happen immediately. That would be too obvious. It would happen next Friday, during the usual push. Just enough delay to seem like a bug. Something minor. Something annoying. Something that couldn't be blamed on any one person. Certainly not on the guy they just labeled obsolete. Now look, I'm not some vengeful saboteur. I didn't plant malware. I didn't take anything with me. I didn't even make a copy of the compliance logs I kept updated religiously for the past 6 years. I just let the house creak where it used to be braced. And I did it with the same quiet, steady hand I'd used for 15 years. Except this time, I wasn't staying to fix it. Because that's what they never understand about people like me. We don't yell. We don't storm out. We don't burn bridges. We just stop holding them up. And when they finally fall, the echo is always louder than the exit. 15 years is a long time to give a place that never once asked you how much you were giving up to stay. especially when the job eats into weekends, hijacks family dinners, and quietly erodes the border between your life and your login. But I stayed. I stayed because I believed in the foundation we were building, because I thought it mattered, because I thought loyalty was still a currency people respected instead of something to be cashed out and discarded the second it stopped looking good on a quarterly slide deck. I came on board back in '07, before the company even had a real name or a website that didn't look like it was built by a board intern during a snow day. There were maybe 20 of us crammed into a downtown space with flickering lights and a server room that doubled as a storage closet. I remember building the first client portal in a borrowed office chair that leaned to the left and made a sound like a dying goose every time I shifted. We didn't have much, no venture money, no HR department, no pre-written culture pamphlets about growth mindset, but we had each other, and we had fire. Back then, I didn't think twice about staying late to reconfigure an entire backend because a client decided they wanted real-time analytics at the 11th hour. I did it because I knew if I didn't, it would fall apart, and because no one else knew where all the hidden wires were yet. I worked through storms, power outages, and system crashes so catastrophic they would have crippled companies 3 times our size. I once drove through a blizzard just to restart a local server because the VPN wasn't syncing properly and we didn't trust the cloud yet. You don't do that kind of thing for the money. You do it because you're proud of the machine and the team trying to run it. But pride has a shelf life, and mine got thinner every year we scaled. As the company grew, so did the layers of management, layers of protocol, layers of people whose only skill was figuring out how to avoid blame while taking credit. I remember when Braden was still an intern, quiet, eager, always asking the right questions but never quite listening to the answers. I taught him how the legacy system really worked, how to navigate the quirks and cracks that didn't show up in documentation because they were the result of real human behavior, not code, not architecture. Just people making rush decisions during crunch time and never cleaning up after themselves. I stayed when the company restructured. I stayed when they moved us to an open office plan that felt like working inside a crowded coffee shop filled with caffeine-addicted toddlers. I stayed when they froze raises for 2 years to stay competitive. I stayed through 2 CIO changes, 3 CTO pivots, and a board that rotated like a carousel of buzzwords and big ideas none of them could actually implement. And through it all, I kept fixing things. Quietly, reliably, invisibly. I trained the next generation, not because I had to, but because it was the right thing to do. And I watched, year after year, as those same kids climbed ladders built on my shoulders, skipped over me in meetings, and slowly stopped including me in decisions because I didn't speak their language, which is to say, I didn't pepper my sentences with enough acronyms or pretend to care about branding strategy. There was one night, maybe 5 years ago now, when the main database cluster failed during a routine migration. Everyone panicked. Braden, then a junior engineer, was white as a sheet. I walked him through the rollback while the rest of the office tried not to scream into their keyboards. We got it back online in 43 minutes. He never said thank you. He just told the room, good teamwork. I remember missing my daughter's dance recital that night. Her first solo. My wife recorded it on her phone, and I watched it in the parking lot while finishing a cold coffee from the break room. I told myself it was worth it, that the job needed me, that one day it would all come back around. But it never did. And now, the same kid I helped save from a career-ending screw-up is sitting across from me on a Zoom call, telling me I'm not growing, that I'm a blocker, that it's time to make room for new talent. He doesn't even know what he owes me. Hell, maybe he never did. Maybe none of them did. I was never flashy, never political, never interested in office drama or climbing over people for a better seat. I just did my job, day in, day out, while others built their reputations on top of my invisible labor. And when the time came to decide who still had value, all they saw was a quiet guy in his 50s who didn't speak in hashtags or pitch decks. What they missed, and what they'll soon regret, is that quiet doesn't mean irrelevant. You don't spend 15 years inside a system without becoming part of its bones. And when you rip out a part like that, things start to shake in ways you don't see until the walls are already cracking. There's a certain poetry in watching a system fall apart not because someone broke it, but because no one bothered to understand how it worked in the first place. The truth is, I didn't build the company's infrastructure to be fragile or mysterious. I built it under pressure, over time, adapting as needs changed, budget shrank, and timelines got squeezed down to the width of a post-it note. There was no master plan, No whiteboard full of pristine logic trees and diagrams labeled scalable architecture. There was just work, constant, reactive, and perfect work, done by people who didn't have time to write a manual because they were too busy holding the damn place together with command line hacks and patched over legacy code that nobody dared touch unless they were absolutely sure the backups were clean. I didn't sabotage anything. Let's make that clear. What I did, and what none of them will ever fully appreciate, is stop babysitting a system that was never built to run without supervision. Because in a company that scales fast and hires faster, they forget that the tools we built weren't plug and play, weren't meant for autopilot, weren't something you could just migrate to a new dashboard and pretend the guts didn't matter. For years, I was the guy who knew when not to touch something, when a weird log entry wasn't an error, just a quirk, when a failed health check wasn't a problem, just a misfire from a sensor we'd installed back when the servers ran hot every summer. Take, for example, the patch script, just a little thing I wrote back in 2013, when we had that ridiculous Thursday night update cycle because someone in legal demanded that no changes be pushed on a Friday. Every Thursday at 2 a.m., that script would run through our main branches, apply queued patches from our internal repo, and then reroute traffic through the updated services once they were verified. But there was a catch, a minor bug, never fixed, because it only mattered during high load. If the load balancer had been updated within the last 48 hours, the post-patch redirect would stall unless you manually restarted the sequence with a legacy flag buried in the job scheduler. I knew this because I'd seen it happen 3 times. And each time, I fixed it without alerting anyone because it didn't need a memo, just attention. I logged the incident, tagged it, low priority, and moved on. Nobody asked. Nobody cared. Nobody noticed. Then came the load testing simulator, another beauty, cobbled together from 2 outdated monitoring frameworks and a sidecar container that only ran during dev sprints. It wasn't in production, but it was tied to the deployment pipeline, and if someone tried to deprecate it without first disabling the audit hooks in the pre-flight check, it would throw silent failures that looked like permission errors. I left notes, commented in plain English, but those notes lived in config files buried 3 layers deep in a private repo that nobody had read access to unless they knew the path. And don't even get me started on the data warehouse. That beast grew sideways for years like a hoarder's attic, filled with temporary tables that became permanent by inertia, scripts that duplicated metrics because product didn't trust analytics, and time zone offsets that made monthly reports look like a conspiracy theory. I managed it not by cleaning it, which, by then, was impossible, but by knowing how to walk through it without stepping on anything explosive. I mapped it in my head, adjusted queries by instinct, and every time a new analyst sent me a Slack message that started with, "Why is this column null?" I answered with patience and a timestamped explanation that went ignored the second they got what they needed. So when Braden took over and started waving around terms like agile replatforming and automated CI/CD refactor, I smiled and nodded, because I knew what was coming. I knew they'd try to replace function with features, maturity with momentum, and they'd assume everything would just work because it looked good on a pitch deck. They wanted dashboards, not diagnostics. They wanted pretty graphs, not performance logs. But I didn't touch a thing. I didn't lock files. I didn't wipe variables. I didn't plant traps or delete backups or do anything you could point at in court. I just logged out. Quietly. Completely. Permanently. And then I waited. Waited for the first maintenance cycle to pass without someone restarting the patch script. Waited for the load balancer to choke on an unflagged redirect. Waited for someone to run a report and realize half the metrics were pointing to tables that hadn't updated in a week. It wouldn't break overnight. No, systems like this don't crash, they decay. Slowly. Quietly. Like drywall molding behind fresh paint. The first symptom would be mild, maybe a few slow API calls, a client portal that hangs during login, or a background job that never finishes but doesn't throw an error loud enough to trigger alerts. Then the logs would fill. Then the retries would spike. And by the time someone figured out where to look, they'd be waist deep in stack traces with no map, no guide, and nobody left to explain how the pieces fit together. I didn't set them up to fail. I just stopped saving them from themselves. It started with a whisper, the kind of low-level system murmur that only people like me ever really pay attention to, a few extra seconds of latency here, a failed background task there. The kind of things the dashboards usually ignore because they're programmed to look for explosions, not for smoke. But smoke is how it always begins, and by the time they realized the fire was real, they didn't have a clue where to aim the hose. I imagine it happened sometime around 3:12 a.m. on a Friday, the perfect hour for unnoticed failure. Just before the start of day traffic hits the East Coast, and just late enough that whoever was on call probably dismissed the first automated ticket as a fluke. The client delivery portal failed its heartbeat check, but the reroute script didn't trigger. That was the first domino. By 4:03, the queued content for 3 different enterprise clients hadn't finished processing. By 5 o'clock, the system logs were flooded with retry attempts for microservices no one had updated in months. The backups didn't restore. Because of course they didn't. Braden would have been asleep, wrapped in expensive sheets with his phone on silent, dreaming of his next keynote address or whatever vision statement he was preparing for Monday's leadership call. He wouldn't have known the chaos was already leaking out, not until 7:11 a.m., when his phone started lighting up like a Christmas tree run on bad wiring. By then, customer support was drowning in tickets, clients were calling their account reps in a panic, and someone in DevOps had made the brilliant decision to reboot a production node without checking dependencies. But me? I was already on the water. There's a lake about 2 hours outside the city that I used to take my daughter to when she was little. Back before her schedule got filled with college applications and social lives, and the kind of teenage silence that makes you wonder if they ever noticed how often you weren't home. I had an old folding chair, a 6-pack of something cold, and a phone that I kept face down on the tackle box because I already knew what would be waiting if I picked it up. It buzzed for the first time at 7:38, then again at 7:40, then again, until it started to feel like a joke, like someone pounding on a door I had already bricked shut. I didn't answer. Back at headquarters, I imagined Braden scrambling, barking orders, shifting blame, forwarding emails to legal with vague subject lines like urgent system issue, all while trying to pretend this wasn't the direct result of decisions he made. Because that's what guys like him do when the music stops. They don't look for the missing chair. They blame the guy who designed the dance floor. I'd heard from a friend, someone still on the inside, someone too smart to talk on record, but too angry to stay silent, that Braden's first move was to throw his infrastructure lead under the bus. Said the issue stemmed from an undocumented system behavior that should have been addressed during the last transition period. Which is corporate code for, I fired the guy who knew how this worked, and now I'm hoping no one remembers that part. Meanwhile, teams were pulling old wikis, searching for notes I'd written years ago and never updated because no one asked. The deployment pipeline stalled. Recovery processes failed silently. Someone tried to spin up a fresh staging environment to replicate the issue and crashed the logging service in the process. By noon, clients were threatening SLA penalties, and the CFO, a guy who once told me we overinvest in IT during a town hall, was in a video call trying to understand why the uptime dashboard was stuck on red. All of it, all the frantic energy, all the last-minute fire drills and apologies and desperate attempts to reverse engineer a system that had grown too complex for its own good. It was the sound of a machine gasping without the guy who used to know which lever to pull when it started to stall. And me? I cracked open another beer and watched a family of ducks float by without a care in the world. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't responsible for saving a place that never once tried to save me. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel cruel. I felt done. Because this is what happens when you treat the people who build a house like old furniture. Eventually, they leave. And when they do, the lights flicker, the walls creak, and suddenly everyone's shocked that no one knows how to reset the breaker. The truth is, nothing I did was out of malice. I didn't hack anything. I didn't sabotage. I didn't break a single law or cross a line that could get me in trouble. I just left. And I took with me all the quiet knowledge no one cared enough to write down, not because it was secret, but because it was taken for granted. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It didn't make headlines. But in those glass-walled offices filled with artificial plants and ego, the silence that followed each failure was loud enough to shake careers. And if Braden Chase was smart, really smart, not just performative smart, he'd finally understand what I meant when I said, "Thanks for the feedback." Because growth? Real growth? It's painful. The call came in late on a Sunday evening, long after the sun had dropped behind the trees and left the lake painted in that quiet shade of burnt gold that always made me feel like time was standing still, like maybe the world had paused long enough for people like me to catch their breath for once. I didn't jump when the phone buzzed, didn't feel any rush of nerves or vindication, just a kind of settled curiosity, the same feeling you get when you already know the end of the movie but want to see how the characters figure it out. The caller ID flashed a number I recognized. Not Braden's personal line, of course, but a blocked corporate switchboard number they used when they didn't want to seem desperate, which made it all the more hilarious considering the only reason you'd call someone like me from a hidden number was if all the visible ones had already failed you. I let it ring twice before I answered, not because I was trying to make a point, but because I was halfway through pouring a fresh glass of bourbon, and I don't rush things anymore for people who wouldn't have noticed if I dropped dead in the break room 6 months ago. "Tom," Braden said, his voice tight, frayed around the edges in a way he probably thought sounded composed, but was cracking with every syllable. "Hey, I know this is unexpected, but I was hoping we could talk for a second. Just man to man." I could hear background noise, muffled voices, maybe legal, maybe someone from PR, maybe just his own conscience trying to claw its way into the conversation. He paused, waiting for me to respond, but I didn't say anything. I just let the silence do what it always does when people finally realize they need you. It pressed in around him like cold air under a locked door. "We're in a tough spot," he finally admitted, like he was doing me a favor by getting real for once. "There's been fallout. Systems are failing, clients are threatening to pull contracts, and legal's asking for clarity on some things we didn't fully document. I know we didn't part ways under the best circumstances, but if you could just help us navigate some of this, we'd really appreciate it." He said, we like there was still a team between us, like we were both part of the same story instead of him being the guy who kicked me out of the building while patting himself on the back for being so forward-thinking. There was a long pause again, filled only with the faint hum of wind through the trees on my end, and whatever fluorescent panic was buzzing around his office on the other. Still, I didn't speak. He tried again. "I know you probably have every right to be upset, and I know we didn't always see eye to eye. But look, we're not asking you to come back. Just point us in the right direction. Help us stabilize. You know the system better than anyone." And there it was. The truth, finally spoken out loud, not in a meeting, not buried in some quarterly report or performance review, but right there in his voice, the acknowledgement that I had been the one keeping it all together. That the whole thing had been sitting on a quiet man's shoulders while they talked about innovation and synergy and growth without once asking who was holding the lights on behind the scenes. I waited a beat longer, took a slow sip of my drink, and let the warmth settle in my chest before I finally answered. "You wanted growth, Braden?" I said, letting every word land like a stone in a still pond. "This is what it feels like." Then I hung up. No fanfare. No speech. Just the soft click of a call ending and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees around me, like the earth itself was exhaling on my behalf. I don't know what happened after that. Maybe they pulled in outside consultants who made it worse. Maybe they spent weeks unraveling systems they barely understood, patching holes with duct tape and buzzwords until something held. Or maybe it all fell apart in slow motion, with clients leaving one by one and Braden eventually stepping down to pursue other opportunities, which is what companies say when they don't want to admit the guy they bet on was all style and no substance. What I do know is this. For the first time in years, I didn't feel tethered to a blinking red light on a dashboard or a Slack notification tagged urgent from someone who didn't even know what system they were breaking. I wasn't responsible anymore. I wasn't a safety net. I wasn't the guy they leaned on without saying thank you. I was just a man sitting by the water, free. And look, I won't lie and pretend there wasn't a part of me that felt a flicker of satisfaction, not revenge, not pettiness, just the quiet justice of watching reality finally catch up to arrogance. Because when you spend 15 years building something with your hands and your time and your health, and then someone tells you it doesn't matter because they've got a shiny new playbook, it's easy to feel like none of it meant anything. Until the day they realize they threw away the instruction manual. Maybe the company will survive. Maybe someone will step up and fix what I left behind. Maybe some young engineer will dig through the logs, find my old notes, and finally understand why I did things the way I did. Or maybe it'll all collapse under the weight of its own hubris. I'm not hoping for either outcome. I've got nothing left in that fight. But what I do have is peace, and that's not something they can lay off or automate or package into a leadership seminar. Sometimes the most honest goodbye is no farewell at all, just silence, distance, and a call you don't answer until you're already too far gone to care what happens next.